Thanks so much for allowing a philosophical interloper to your conference here. I was talking to Jill on the shuttle over, and they were saying that philosophy is like the paradigm of the master's tools. And I totally agree with that, and I appreciate your trust in letting me talk for a little bit. So as a philosopher, a lot of what I do is think about the sort of fundamental concepts that we use to understand the world, to do our theoretical research, to do the social scientific research, and so on. And so what I'm going to be doing today is thinking about what is fundamental to our concept of gender injustice, and importantly, what is fundamental to our concept of patriarchy that I think underlies a lot of the way we think about systemic gender injustice and how we operationalize that in our research. So who recognizes this person? Yeah, like half the room. Yeah, all right, cool. So this is Megan Rapinoe, who is the midfielder for the women's national soccer team in the US, who has done a lot of work on getting equal pay for women athletes in soccer. And one of the things I love about Rapinoe is that she's really good at good quips in interviews. And one of the favorite quips I have from her in an interview is this. She says, "Men have run the world for all these years. Maybe they should just take a few hundred years off, and we women can take it for a few hundred years, and we'll see where we are." Right? And what I really want to highlight about this, it's a great quote, great for a quip for an interview, but it has this particular picture of how the world is set up that's built into it, which is a dichotomy of men versus women. We live in a society where men are privileged, men get the resources, and women are left to pick up the scraps. Men run the world, women just have to put up with the way that men run the world. And this view about the way the world is set up is deeply embedded in our view of what the received view, the widely accepted view of what patriarchy is. So the accepted view of what patriarchy is one where patriarchy is a social system that privileges men and disadvantages women, thereby producing men's dominance and women's subjugation. We see this show up in a lot of feminist literature, particularly from the late 20th century. So for example, Catherine McKinnon writes, "Women have systematically been subjected to physical insecurity, targeted for sexual denigration and violation, depersonalized and denigrated, deprived of respect, credibility, and resources, and silenced." This is the important part. Men as men have generally not had these things done to them. Men have done these things to women. So we see that this view of patriarchy is also showing up in the analysis of where gender injustice appears in the world. Women are subject to gender injustice, and men do those things to women. Men are not subject to gender injustice. Similarly, we see Marilyn Frye write, "If a man has little or no material or political power, or achieves little of what he wants to achieve, his being male is no part of the explanation. Being male is something he has going for him, even if race or class or age or disability is going against him. Women are oppressed as women, but men are not oppressed as men. And isn't it strange that any of us should have been confused and mystified about such a simple thing?" So this is really, my point in bringing these quotations out is to see how deeply embedded this kind of binary framework for thinking about gender injustice is, not only in our view of patriarchy, but in a lot of the views that follow from our view of patriarchy, our views about what is gender discrimination, what is gendered violence, what is gender injustice, and probably what is gender justice, right? So my question that's guiding a book that I'm writing and I'm talking about today is this question, what is patriarchy? And also, why does this question matter? Why does it matter to ask this question of what patriarchy is? So here I'm going to take a quick aside to talk a little bit about how I think about these what is questions, particularly as a philosopher. So when we ask a question like, what is patriarchy? Clearly, we're not asking, what is our current understanding of what patriarchy is? We all know what the current understanding is, right? It's the one where patriarchy privileges men over women. That's not very interesting. What we're asking is whether that received understanding needs to be improved or modified. Whether the thing we're trying to talk about is something different than the received understanding of what that thing is. And that should be very familiar from the history of science, right? When people asked, what is disease? And they thought it was bad air, they weren't asking whether disease was bad air, they were asking whether the thing they used the concept of disease to talk about is well described by the received understanding of what disease is. And as they understood that thing more, and they realized, hey, look, the received understanding is not matching up with the phenomenon we wanted to talk about, they had to update their understanding of the concept of disease for the purpose of their research. So similarly, when I ask a question like, what is patriarchy, I think the first question to ask is, what do we use this concept for? what is the phenomenon we're trying to talk about in the world when we use a concept like patriarchy? And does the received understanding, the one that says patriarchy is a system that puts men over women, actually accurately describe that thing we're trying to talk about? So what is the conceptual labor of this concept? I think it does a lot, actually, even when we don't explicitly use the term. Patriarchy is used to talk about the source of systemic gender injustice. It is the system that underlies all of our talk of systemic gender injustice. And because of that, it is both informed by and informs a lot of our concepts that surround systemic gender injustice, including things like gender discrimination, feminism and what the purpose of feminism is, what gender-based violence is. So you'll often hear gender-based violence used interchangeably with violence against women, for example. Our concepts of gender equality and inequality, and importantly, how ERGs and DEI work approach the concept of what it means to create gender injustice within our institutions, where there's this focus on women as a demographic category, where that's the thing that the sole focus of these kinds of institutions and organizations have. So the question then is, does patriarchy help us does it track lived experience? Does it track the actual realities of how things like gender injustice and gender discrimination are appearing in the world, and help us illuminate the source of patterns of unjust distribution of resources and esteem that appear and that are explained because of something about gender? So I think that the answer is no. And let me give you just a few examples. So I think that, for example, this view of patriarchy does not help us explain how gay men were treated during the AIDS epidemic. In those cases, gay men were not privileged as men while being disadvantaged while gay. That makes absolutely no sense. Rather, it's the case that their sexuality changed how they were perceived and treated as men. The fact that they were men was part of the explanation for why their lives were so discarded during that period of time. Similarly, I think what we're seeing a lot in the US right now is a lot of focus on how this is also true for black men, and how race, similarly to the way that sexuality does, colors how someone is perceived and treated as a man. And as the philosopher Tommy Curry has pointed out, black men don't occupy a privileged disadvantaged status. It is not the case that they are privileged as men while being disadvantaged as black when it comes to things like police brutality and mass incarceration. The fact that they are men is part of the explanation for why they are subject to certain kinds of systemic injustices. And again, this accepted view is not going to make sense of these cases and many other cases like that. And then another kind of case that I think is important to draw attention to is the fact that this accepted view completely erases from our view the kinds of discrimination and injustice that people experience because they are intersex or androgynous in some sort of way. So people who are not able to be easily classified as either men or women are subject to huge forms of harm and disadvantage because they are unable to be classified. And that is also true, I mean, to point out too, in history, this has also been true of people we would now identify as gay men or black men. So gay men were labeled as inverts, a kind of third gender that existed outside the realm of the gender binary, and were punished for that reason. In the 19th century, you have different kinds of pseudoscientific theories that said that black indigenous people didn't occupy the same level of evolution of species. And so while they were male or female in the sense that maybe like, you know, dogs and bears can be male or female, they weren't humans. And so they did not belong to the gendered order of men and women. And so here again, you see that it's just looking at patriarchy, looking at systemic gender injustice just through this lens of a binary hierarchy can't actually capture what I think are pretty paradigmatic cases of systemic gender injustice through our history and through our society. So the upshot of all that is just to say that the accepted view of patriarchy, I think, and in ways that infect a lot of our work in feminism and gender justice organizations, distorts or erases huge amounts of gender injustice that do and have existed in our world. It erases those that target marginalized men, it erases those that have bodies that defy a binary classification, and as many others have also pointed out, it struggles to explain hierarchies among women because its sole focus is on men versus women. So it doesn't talk about the relations that exist between, say, white women and black women, or straight women and lesbians, and so on. And so I think the reason for this, to just go at a very quick aside, I think the reason for this is that the original concept of patriarchy that was picked up by a lot of these feminists was one that was focused on gender order within the household. You have the patriarch who's in charge of the household. And those feminists said, hey, you're missing the forest for the trees. We need to think about gender order in society, not just gender order in the household. And yet they left the binary structure of the previous concept when they brought it into society as a whole, rather than recognizing that once you go to society as a whole, we now need to look at a lot more scrambled relations of gendered power that exist once we take a broader perspective. All right, so where do we go from there, right? So one option would be to say, and Judith Butler and Sally Haslinger have said this, let's just do away with the concept of patriarchy. We don't need it. I think that that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater because, again, I think the conceptual labor that we ask the concept of patriarchy to do is incredibly important. If we're going to talk about systemic gender injustice, we're already implying that there is a system that is responsible for predictable patterns of gendered treatment. So if we don't have a view about what that system is, I think we are left with kind of, at best, piecemeal phenomenon that we can't make sense of in a systematic way. I think it's important, if we can, to preserve this concept. So the project of my book is to try to give an alternate picture, one that can both help us make sense of the lived experiences that we see of gender injustice without falling into many of the pitfalls that the previous concept has. Okay, so here's my view. I think that patriarchy is the institutionalized system of gendering that produces real men's dominance. So I'm going to spend the rest of the time unpacking what that means. So first, what is gendering? In my view, gender fundamentally is the process, the social relational process of gendering. And gendering is evaluating and regulating people in accordance with cultural ideals of what men and women ought to be. So we stand in this relation, importantly, you right now stand in this relation to everyone in this room, you stand in this relation to the state, to technology, and very importantly, you stand in this relation to yourself, right? We are constantly evaluating and regulating ourselves, also on the basis of these ideals of what we think men and women ought to be. And one thing that's very important for my ontology of this is that gendering is prior to the feature of being a man or a woman. And I think this is something that has been hugely overlooked and missed in the history of feminist thought about gender injustice, because they have taken gender, or some would say, sometimes they'll say sex, as the fundamental thing that we're talking about when we talk about gender injustice. Gender injustice is injustice that is explained by gender. So that puts lots of pressure on what our view of gender is. If we think that gender fundamentally is being a man or a woman, where that's a feature of an individual, that's going to radically change what we're looking for when we look for gender injustice, rather than if we recognize each one of us is more fundamentally a human being than we are male or female, or a man or a woman. We're male or female because that's a way that our body has been classified, and those classifications have changed over time and across contexts. That's a social classification of the body. So when we understand that gendering is the process that makes us into male or female, makes us into men or women, then we can see that that process is the most fundamental thing to think about when we think about gender. And so gender injustice becomes injustice that is explained by that process, rather than one that is explained by a particular feature of individuals. So now I want to say a little bit more about how I understand these cultural ideals. So the first two things is that I think that these ideals have two main tenets. The first is one of teleology. So teleology is a very common mode of human reasoning in which we think what something is and what something is for are deeply bound up in each other. So a good example of this would be something like a knife or a toaster, where we think what it is for something to be a knife is it to have a particular function, and something that has that function is a knife, right? These, what something is and what it's for, are interdefined. And there is a lot of empirical psychological evidence showing that gender is one of the most teleologically understood things by people, where human bodies are understood to be something that should be either male or female because they are human. And if you are male or female, you ought to be either the ways a man ought to be or the ways a woman ought to be, because your body is like that. So there's a teleological chain, in other words, between the fact that you're human and the fact that you should either be a male who is the way men ought to be, or a female who is the way women ought to be, or what I call in my book, real men and real women, right? So we have these two paradigms of the human that are a dichotomous paradigm of the human. And then the second thing is an evaluation between these ways of being, where real manhood is understood as the most valuable form of human life. So it's not only the case that by virtue of being human, you should be either a real man or a real woman, even if those things are unattainable for you because of how that's set up, but also, if you're a real man, that's the best way for a human to be. It makes you more valuable than other human beings. So that's kind of what I think is important structure for the content of these cultural ideals. Now I want to talk a little bit about what I mean when I talk about cultural ideals. So there's three main features I want to draw to your attention. The first is that cultural ideals of what men and women should be are dynamic and they're contextual. They change over time, they change across contexts. How you're expected to be as a man or a woman in this room right now at Harvard Business School is probably different than how you're expected to be at church or in your department or in your home, et cetera. It changes across context. But also they change over time. So for example, in American history, it used to be the case that the ideal male body was lean and wiry. Then you have the Industrial Revolution and it becomes filled out and muscular, et cetera, et cetera. And there's umpteen examples of the way that that changes. The second thing is that when I talk about cultural ideals, it's very important that I'm not talking about something that lives in the head. I'm not talking about beliefs. I'm not talking about stereotypes that are just assumptions. I am talking about I'm drawing from Althusser, but I'm talking about the material world as text. So if you think about like anthropologists or archaeologists, they go and they look at the structure of civilizations where there aren't people there anymore, right? They don't get to do interviews with people, and yet they can read off of the material space a lot of what the values and ideals of that culture was. And I think we do the same thing, and we have even more information constantly that we're constantly reading the ideals off of interactions between people, off of the spaces that we navigate, off of the laws and corporations that we interact with, and so on. So when I talk about these ideals, I'm talking about something that is contained in the material world. And when we have explicit beliefs, I think those beliefs are more reflections of the ideals that exist in the world, rather than the ideals being something that live in the head. And then the last point I want to make is that these ideals are thoroughly intersectional. And I want to say a little bit about what I mean by that, because I think the word intersectionality gets thrown around a lot, and people just kind of like hand wave, it's intersectional. So let me say what I mean. Okay, here is a bunch of lines and shading on a page. Does this contain a duck image, or does it contain a rabbit image? Hopefully the answer you're saying is yes, it contains both, right? They are both contained in the lines and shading, and importantly, they are different and they are real and they help us answer different questions. If my kid looks at that and they go, quack, I need to appeal to the duck image in order to explain why that occurred. There's an answer, I'm giving an answer to why a certain phenomenon happened, and I'll appeal to the duck image in order to answer that question. If someone else looks at it and says, oh, that's a cute bunny, I'll appeal to the rabbit image in order to explain that. But importantly, because they are made up of the same material lines and shading, they each have to incorporate the elements of the other. There is no separation in the material world of the two. And this is how I think about what we mean when we talk about intersectionality and when we talk about things like gender ideals versus racial ideals, or patriarchy and white supremacy and capitalism. They're all made up of the same material stuff in the world. They're the ongoings of our states, of our institutions, of our educational organizations, and so on. But they're importantly different. They are real and they are different, and they help us answer different questions. But nevertheless, they are co-constituted by the same material stuff in the world. So that's really important too. When we talk about these gender ideals, it is a way of seeing the material world as text that is not better than other ways of seeing it, except in response to particular questions that we're asking or certain things we're trying to explain. Okay, so the second part of my view is this focus on real men instead of men. And I'm using real men here both because it's like a cultural term that people get, and like as soon as I say real men, you like already kind of have a sense of what I'm talking about, even if it's also sort of funny. But I'm using it as a technical term that draws on the cultural understanding, where real men are the group of people whose features are most valued by our most powerful and most institutionalized cultural ideals of manhood. That is, the ideals of what makes someone a man and how someone ought to be given that they're a man. And once again, it won't surprise you that like you can read these things off of the material world. Also, we look at who are the people that are systematically given power and esteem, what do they tend to look like, how do their features correlate with the positions that they occupy. And we all, I'm sure, would know this without looking at images, but we know that what's most valuable for someone in our culture is not only to be a man, right? Because that's not true. Someone who's a man can be very punished because they're a man if they're non-conforming, or if they're black, or if they're gay, or all these things. It's rather a constellation of features that's being white, and it's being non-disabled, and it's being straight, and it's being a man. It's the ideal form of human that we can understand both through the lens of gender, or we can understand it through the lens of race, or we can understand it through the lens of class, always keeping in mind that each of those have to incorporate the elements of the other. Okay, so what's the upshot here? The upshot is that I think this view of patriarchy calls us to reconceive what we're talking about when we talk about systemic gender injustice in terms of institutionalized gendering rather than in terms of these demographic categories of men or women. And understanding that this process of institutionalized gendering, foremost directs resources and esteem and respect towards real men, whatever that means in the given context we're looking at, and unfairly harms people who are androgynous, marginalized men, and women, and especially women who do not closely resemble the institutionalized ideals of what women ought to be. And I think that this will, if we take this and take this to heart, it calls for some, not only creates lots of important avenues for allyship between different kinds of justice groups, because they can see how they're all embedded with each other, but it also calls us to pretty radically reconceive how we set up these organizations in the first place. So how would we set up like an ERG, a gender ERG in an organization differently if we think about the institution as one that is gendering and creating hierarchy out of gendering instead of one that's just benefiting men while putting down women? And how do we really get things wrong in ways that have concrete implications for people when we impose that binary framework onto our understanding of how injustice is operating? Thank you.